The Lord of the Rings was a huge gamble for New Line Cinema in 2001. They bet literally hundreds of millions of dollars to adapt not one, but 3 books into a trilogy of movies that would be filmed simultaneously. If these films didn't work, they would ruin the careers of everyone involved. And yet the film almost came out dramatically different because of a very different actor being cast as the now beloved character, Aragorn. The Lord of the Rings, written by J.R.R. Tolkien, was originally published in 1955. The trilogy of books, originally intended to be a single volume, is one of the highest-selling novel series in history. Tolkien's book series was originally set up at Miramax, with Fran Walsh and Peter Jackson's adaptations. However, due to behind-the-scenes frictions and Disney putting a cap on what Miramax could spend per picture, Jackson and Walsh took the project to every other studio in Hollywood looking for someone to fund the epic production. Only one person said yes, Bob Shaye at New Line Cinema. In an unprecedented move, he said he would fund 3 films, all filmed simultaneously. This caused Jackson and Walsh to have to prepare the films and cast the large ensemble of characters quickly but very deliberately. After the parts of Frodo and Gandalf, arguably the most essential casting to get correct was that of Strider, aka Aragorn, aka the once and future king of Gondor. Unlike in the novels, where he's much more of a heroic archetype, Aragorn in the films is a man in emotional hiding. He's someone who, over the course of the 3 films, has an arc. He grows into his ability to accept the crown of the realm of Gondor. The man originally cast as the part was Stuart Townsend. Townsend gained widespread acclaim for his turn in the film about Adam. This put him on the map with the US studios, and before he knew it, he was a star in the making. Jackson wanted him for the role of Aragorn because of his intensity, brooding good looks, and youthful energy. He wanted him to balance out Gandalf's older, more Shakespearean tone. However, New Line Cinema executives were concerned that Townsend appeared too young for the role, that he would not be able to convincingly portray a man grappling with the burden of becoming king. However, Jackson and Walsh were convinced that Townsend was the best actor for the role. They wanted actors who were committed to their parts, who truly inhabited the characters as opposed to big movie stars. The fact that the shooting of the 3 films back-to-back would take 18 months meant that the decisions held a lot of weight. The back and forth between Jackson and New Line went so far as the studio insisting that Townsend do a full screen test before officially being given the part. The screen test was never publicly released. However, it's been said that Townsend was flown to New Zealand, fitted for a costume, and filmed an entire scene as the prancing pony. The only evidence that this ever happened is this photo. Unfortunately, things began to quickly turn sour. As the rest of the cast and crew arrived, rehearsals started and tensions rose. It became clear that Townsend didn't fit in well with the rest of the cast. It didn't seem like he wanted to be there. His attitude worsened with every day that filming grew closer. He did not want to rehearse, he did not want to learn how to ride horses, and did not want to learn any fight choreography. Reputable sources have repeatedly said that his constant refrain during all of this was, "You'll get it on the day." This even led to Sir Ian McKellen pulling him aside and asking him, "Do you even want to be here?"
Fool of a took.
This conflict between Townsend and the production eventually reached a breaking point. On the second day of filming, while shooting the scene of the hobbits under the tree cowering in fear from the ring wraiths, Jackson turned to his producer and said the fateful words that would alter Stuart Townsend's life forever. "I don't think I can work with Stuart." By this point, the train had left the station. It was too late to switch actors, and yet they had to. Jackson felt there was no other way forward. New Line execs went into a tailspin. They frantically made calls, reaching out to agents and managers, checking actor availability. Ultimately, 3 actors were the final contenders: Jason Patric, Russell Crowe, and Viggo Mortensen. Jason Patric was deemed not a big enough star by the studio. Russell Crowe passed on the opportunity because he had just done Gladiator and didn't want to be typecast in fantasy or period epics. So, it all came down to Viggo Mortensen. Mortensen was an outdoorsman, knew how to ride horses, and was a trained swordsman. He was also familiar with the folklore that The Lord of the Rings was pulled from. He was offered the part and literally days later was on a plane to New Zealand. Lacking any time to prepare, he was thrown into the deep end. He was given chunks of the script to read, but was not allowed to see the whole part due to secrecy surrounding the shoot. This made preparing for the role more difficult. He was also not given any time with the other actors. His first day in New Zealand was literally the first day of shooting, unlike the other actors who had been around for 6 weeks of rehearsals and fight training. In fact, when Sam and Frodo were sitting on the table at the Prancing Pony, and Sam says,
That fellow's done nothing but stare at you since we arrived.
There was no Aragorn in the movie. They literally didn't know who was going to play the part. Sam and Frodo were playing to an empty corner of the room. However, it would be later in the same location that Mortensen would embody Strider for the first time. The scene in The Prancing Pony where he talks to Frodo in the side room was the first scene shot with his character. Peter Jackson has even said that he doesn't think Viggo got the character down right. He said he was obviously still discovering him. Thankfully, Mortensen was a quick study. When they shot the fight with the ring wraiths at Weathertop, everything clicked into place. Jackson said he could see it happening in real time. Mortensen was embracing the animalistic nature of Aragorn and fully embodying the character. The now iconic shot of Aragorn swinging the torch into the camera lens was completely improvised by Mortensen. That was the moment that he truly became the King of Gondor to the director and the crew. When the film was released, it became a global phenomenon, as we all know. Townsend, he went on to quickly star in both the Anne Rice adaptation, Queen of the Damned in 2002, and League of Extraordinary Gentlemen in 2003. After those high-profile flameouts, his career has never quite been the same, despite marrying Charlize Theron and appearing in the criminally underrated TV show 13. Stuart Townsend's name has been one that's more or less been lost to obscurity. The lesson here is, when your big shot comes, meet it head on. Townsend appears to have been crippled by ego, nerves, and a combination of overconfidence and self-doubt. He got cast in arguably the biggest film franchise of all time, and if he had just been humble and put in the work and really tried to become a member of the team, he'd have a significantly different career. However, it's hard to know those things when you're in the moment, when you're consumed by pressures and the tension of traveling halfway across the world. There are many stories like Townsend. Hugh Jackman wasn't originally cast as Wolverine. The part went to Dougray Scott, who was injured while filming Mission Impossible 2, and, well, the rest is history.
He said he wanted me.
Things move so quickly in the film business that everything is always in a constant state of flux. There are so many ways that things can go. Some are actively malicious, and some are just happenstance. But the fact that so many now iconic performances came from last-minute substitutions is almost incomprehensible. The most unfortunate part of this whole story for Stuart Townsend is that everything seems to have ended the correct way. Let's face it, Stuart Townsend doesn't look old or grizzled enough to be Aragorn. This was a concern from the start by New Line executives, and they actually had a significant point. In the books, Aragorn is 87 years old. Yes, the people of Middle-earth age slower and have longer lifespans, but are you really going to tell me that you buy Stuart Townsend over the weathered and worldly Viggo Mortensen?
For Frodo.
No, of course not. Mortensen's gravitas and regality was key to making the three-film saga actually work. This is the Battle of Helm's Deep. It's often cited as one of the best sequences of the entire Lord of the Rings movie trilogy, but before it could triumph in theaters and extended editions, Helm's Deep had to survive the rigorous process of film editing. While several changes were made for the final cut, one stands out above the rest. The decision to completely remove one character from the battle had a significant impact on the entire trilogy and is still scrutinized by fans today.
So it begins.
The Battle of Helm's Deep in 2002's The Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers is as legendary in-universe as it is to fans of the franchise. Known to book readers as the Battle of the Hornburg, the sequence represents a major turn in the fight against Saruman's forces. It's a tale of cunning strategy, friendship, and hope in the face of a seemingly impossible task. The process of bringing the battle to the big screen actually boasts a fairly similar tale. It also seemed to be an impossible task which required hundreds of members of the cast and crew to make it a reality. Ultimately, however, it was Peter Jackson, Philippa Boyens, and Fran Walsh who rode in at first light on the 5th day and changed everything. Was it changed for the better? Well, that depends on what side of the conflict you're on. As is the nature of adaptation, there was no way to produce a perfect recreation of J.R.R. Tolkien's words in a new medium.
If you were to just shoot the book page by page, scene by scene, it would just be a mess.
Peter Jackson and company endeavored to honor the spirit of his words. This was the case for the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy, not just Helm's Deep. As a consequence, fans have been debating the validity and necessity of every little change since the movies were first released. Chief among those changes are the ones made to Lady Arwen Evenstar. Tolkien wrote Arwen as less of a character and more of an ornament on Aragorn's crown. An ethereal elven maiden that stands silently at his side, bears his son, and weeps for him when he's gone. Liv Tyler's portrayal of the character is very different. The choice to give Arwen more agency was a deliberate one on the part of the filmmakers, and though it made the trilogy stronger overall, it was met with a massive amount of backlash in the early 2000s. Before Fellowship was even out, fans had latched onto a clip in the trailer featuring Arwen saying the new iconic line,
"If you want him, come."
come and claim him.
Online speculators feared that they would officially adopt Arwen as a member of the Fellowship. Fear gave way to public outcry when they watched the movie, only to learn that she had effectively replaced the character of Glorfindel. Comparisons to Xena Warrior Princess followed soon after, and a certain subset of fans were ready to write off the whole trilogy as an apocryphal blight on Tolkien's work. Now, imagine what they might have said if Arwen had fought at Helm's Deep as originally intended.
We had a romance where the two characters, Aragorn and Arwen, were in two completely different places in Middle-earth. So how on earth can you keep a romantic story going when you can't actually have the two people connecting?
Yes, even though she isn't there in the book, the Lady of Rivendell was supposed to fight alongside Aragorn and the others at Helm's Deep. And this wasn't just an idea that got thrown around during the writing process. Arwen's participation very nearly made it into the theatrical version of Two Towers. Liv Tyler and her stunt double Lonnie Jackson filmed plenty of scenes on the Helm's Deep set. It's unclear whether Haldir was there in addition to Arwen or if he was added in later to replace her. We do know, thanks to commentary from producer Barry Osborne, that the scene in which Aragorn runs to save Haldir is actually footage recycled from a deleted scene where he was instead running to save Arwen. But make no mistake, she wasn't just a damsel in distress. Equipped with the elven sword Hathafang, Arwen would have done more than just slay her fair share of orcs at Helm's Deep. She appeared in so many integral moments that she actually had to be digitally removed from multiple shots in the finished movie. According to an anecdote shared by Orlando Bloom in the appendices of the Two Towers.
Initially it was, I think, Liv threw down a rope and then we pulled them up together. I think they painted her out or something like that because they decided that she wasn't going to be in that sequence.
Next time you rewatch The Two Towers, pay attention to the moment where Aragorn orders everyone to retreat behind the walls, and you'll see a conspicuous elven woman in a red dress running beside him. Later, when the Rohirrim descended onto the orcs at dawn, you can catch a glimpse of her again in the chaos. Though they did their best to digitally disguise her when she couldn't be totally removed, it's easy to spot her and her horse Asphaloth once you know where to look. So you may be wondering, why go to all this trouble? Why write Arwen into the Battle of Helm's Deep, film Liv Tyler and Laney Jackson on set, and then go through the painstaking effort to digitally remove her? The answer is multifaceted, yet it can be summarized with one word: intent.
You could, in fact, tell the story as written with these two main characters being apart from each other because they were always together.
In Tolkien's work, the two of them are rarely in the same physical location and barely speak to each other. While Jackson, Boyens, and Walsh did set out to make Arwen feel like her own character, they also wanted her relationship with Aragorn to be believable and emotionally satisfying. When they see each other at the end of Return of the King, it's important that the audience understands the depth of their devotion to one another. Several choices were made to reflect that intent over the course of all three movies, including a more antagonistic relationship with Arwen's father Elrond, a handful of dreams and vision sequences, and the aforementioned Ringwraith chase scene. Arwen fighting at Helm's Deep was supposed to be just another addition to her character and story. As Jackson put it in a behind-the-scenes commentary track,
Originally, we thought that's a great opportunity for Arwen to reappear and to have another connection between her and Aragorn.
Remember that Jackson, Boyens, and Walsh were deeply concerned with paying homage to Tolkien's work. In universe, there's an emphasis on the last alliance of elves and men, but there aren't actually any elves at Helm's Deep other than Legolas. Rather, Elrond sends his two sons to aid Aragorn on his quest to recruit the dead men of Dunharrow. Of course, we don't see Elrond's sons in the movie adaptations, so the alliance is instead represented by having the elves fight in the Battle of Helm's Deep. Arwen would have been a facsimile for her brother's thematic role in Aragorn's story. In lieu of Arwen, we're left with Haldir, whose minimal role and useless death do very little to serve the narrative. From this perspective, it should be easy to understand why the writers chose to bring Arwen to Helm's Deep. So why did they decide against it in the end? While they've never explicitly stated as much, it stands to reason that the backlash against Arwen's action scene in The Fellowship of the Ring had some effect on the direction they took her character in the subsequent films. Arwen, Warrior Princess, wasn't the image the filmmakers intended to portray. Still, there's more to it than petty fan discourse.
People don't think that we ever look at this stuff, and I once made the mistake of going and reading some of the stuff, and I cried so hard.
Having a female character jump so easily into battle in Two Towers could have seriously diminished the impact of Éowyn's storyline in Return of the King. Arwen and Éowyn are two of only 3 women with speaking roles in the entirety of The Lord of the Rings, so Jackson and his co-writers simply couldn't afford to undermine Éowyn's contribution to the plot.
Whatever happens, stay with me. I'll look after you.
If that's not convincing enough, perhaps the most compelling reason to take Arwen out of Helm's Deep comes from Liv Tyler herself.
I just went right back into the book. And what we came to realize was that you don't have to put a sword in her hands to make her strong.
Tolkien's Lord of the Rings explores the horrors of war and champions peace above all. He isn't trying to glorify violence or set his reader's heart racing with adrenaline-fueled action. He's telling a story about friendship, brotherhood, and how even the smallest person can make a difference if there's good in their heart. So even though seeing Arwen going toe-to-toe with orcs at Helm's Deep would have been inarguably cool to see, it isn't in keeping with the most important aspect of Tolkien's story. While her presence represented the last alliance of elves and men and strengthened her on-screen bond with Aragorn, it ultimately would have had a negative effect on the rest of the trilogy and on Tolkien's intent.
You have my sword. And you have my bow.
And my axe.
This is the only line in the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy in which Legolas speaks directly to Frodo. 5 words across 9 hours of runtime, 11 if you're watching the extended editions, and we can't even be sure our intrepid hobbit knows Legolas' name by the end of the whole ordeal since he never says it. This is only an admittedly hilarious symptom of the larger, more serious problem at play. In J.R.R. Tolkien's books, the elves of Middle-earth are an unendingly interesting race of beings that manage to be both impish rascals and ethereal enigmas. They laugh, they sing, they drink to excess, and they wax poetic about the nature of their eternal lives. Though he did an excellent job bringing them to the big screen, Peter Jackson's versions of these characters lean a little further into mystical godlike territory. Jackson's elves are capable of astonishing supernatural feats and would never suffer the indignation of drinking themselves under the table, at least until the Hobbit movies. The point remains that some of the most interesting characters in the movies are elves, but Legolas, the elven branch of the Fellowship, he's not one of them. Legolas Greenleaf of the Woodland Realms, son of King Thranduil, Prince of Mirkwood, and master of squinting pensively into the distance. Everyone's favorite elven archer possesses many complicated titles with their own equally complicated backstories. He is tied to a deep history written into the lore of Middle-earth, and yet his character across all of the Lord of the Rings movies is stretched and thin, like butter scraped over too much bread. Considering Jackson's trilogy is widely regarded as a masterpiece, it may be difficult to find fault in them, but even outstanding works like The Lord of the Rings have room for improvement. And Legolas's extreme physical prowess, the bulking of his more jovial personality from the books, and the lack of real development make for one of the weakest points in the entire movie franchise. When Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings, he ended up establishing a new baseline for elves in high fantasy. Long-living elves who are fleet of foot, live in forests, and distrust other races may seem like an all-too-common trope today. But in 1954, this was fairly new ground Tolkien was lightly trotting on. All that Legolas is in the movies comes back to Tolkien's original vision. But in the almost 50 years between the book's publication and the first Lord of the Rings movie, audiences had plenty of time to familiarize themselves with similar characters from other properties. When Legolas shows up in 2001's Fellowship of the Ring doing something like this, it's undeniably cool. But it isn't novel the way it had been when Tolkien first conceived the character, especially considering Aragorn is right there with him keeping pace. The movies had to find a way to differentiate Legolas from the other skilled warriors of the Fellowship. So Jackson stepped up the elven action to make it more impressive. This, along with Jackson's action-oriented style, is why we got the shield surfing moment in Helm's Deep in Two Towers and the Oliphant takedown in Return of the King.
Legolas! Two already?
I'm on 17!
No longer is Legolas a competent elf who honed his craft over hundreds of years of practice. He's a superhero capable of impossible feats of strength, accuracy, and balance. He's a one-man army that puts even the other elves to shame. Even though some of these shots make for more memorable visuals, they ultimately detract from the experience. What are meant to be serious battle scenes become comical opportunities to see superpowers on display, and for no other reason than to remind us that Legolas is cool.
That still only counts as one.
This idea is elevated to insane levels of self-parody in the Hobbit movies. Unlike in The Lord of the Rings, these sorts of scenes are often tied inextricably to the plot rather than being exciting little detours during important moments. What's worse is that Legolas had no business being in the Hobbit movies to begin with, which makes these death-defying stunts all the more unnecessary. The problem is, outside of his combat expertise, what does Legolas actually bring to the story? The answer to that is he brings virtually nothing. That's a glaring issue in the Hobbit movies, but it was also present during the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Orlando Bloom's performance as the Elven Prince has long been a point of contention amongst fans. To give the then 24-year-old actor his due, he didn't have much to work with. As written in the movies, Legolas has very little in the way of a personality. In the books, he is often portrayed as a light-hearted jokester who playfully taunts the other members of the Fellowship and offers up songs of joy or lament when the need arises. In the movies, particularly the theatrical cuts, Legolas is a staunchly emotionless rock for most of his screen time, just like the rest of the elves. Even in the scenes which are meant to be his most passionate, he says every line with the same bored tone.
Forgive me. I was wrong to despair.
The extended editions add several scenes which give him moments of much-needed levity, but they are few and far between, and don't really do much to make it feel like Legolas is anything other than an ancient being who's tired and just trying to get a job done.
43. He was already dead.
He was twitching.
Even more dire than his lack of personality is his lack of any form of character development. The only trait Legolas has which he gets to overcome is his hatred of dwarves. It's true that the exchange between him and Gimli in Return of the King will forever bring a tear to our eyes.
I thought I'd die fighting side by side with an elf.
What about side by side with a friend?
His growing fondness for Gimli is heartwarming, and it serves as a reminder of what this fellowship could mean for the future, that being stronger bonds between the races of Middle-earth, and a new era of peace. But a single friendship between an elf and a dwarf does not make up for ages of resentment, and even if it did, Gimli's relationship with Galadriel fulfills a similar role. The same can be said for Legolas's admiration towards Aragorn, which on the surface looks like a pretty straightforward echo of his friendship with Gimli. Over the course of 3 movies, you'd expect Legolas to become more devoted to the future king, or maybe even doubt him. But he was already a loyal friend at the start of their journey, and any conflict between them is fleeting. The true mark of the elves' acceptance of Aragorn comes from the relationship between him and Elrond, which Legolas has no part in. For the most part, the rest of the Fellowship takes a much more active role in the story. Boromir shows us the esoteric power of the ring and completes his own self-sacrificing arc. Aragorn smooths political tensions, finds the kingly resolve to lead armies, and is finally installed on the throne with Arwen at his side. Frodo inspires the others and carries the ring. Sam carries the entire operation. And Gandalf? Well, he's Gandalf. Even Merry and Pippin orchestrate the last march of the Ents. Legolas, and to a lesser extent Gimli, makes a friend. But even Gimli got to ruminate on the loss of his kinsmen in the mines of Moria and charm the Lady of the Woods with a humble yet significant request for a strand of her hair.
What was her gift?
I asked her for one hair from her golden head.
Other than taking down enemies with aforementioned super strength and skill, Legolas is practically useless. He's so useless that they resort to making him an exposition machine in order to give him a few additional lines.
They're taking the hobbits to Isengard!
It doesn't help that a lot of Legolas's most important beats in the books happen in the appendices of The Return of the King, and we saw next to none of it in the movies. Considering the direct impact many of the other characters had on the story of Lord of the Rings, Legolas's contributions seem almost laughable by comparison. But it didn't have to be this way. The Lord of the Rings movies took liberties with several characters from the books. The screenplays written by Jackson, Fran Walsh, and Philippa Boyens were intended to make the story fit a more traditional Hollywood structure. Aragorn was given a self-defeating attitude to overcome, and Glorfindel was removed from the plot to strengthen Arwen's character. A wedge was driven between Frodo and Sam for some extra dramatic tension, and some characters were erased entirely to make room for growth in our main cast. Whether all those changes were for the better is up to the individual viewer. However, they help to illustrate the point. Legolas could have been given more time and attention. There was an attempt to do this in the Hobbit trilogy, where they gave him a terrible love triangle plotline, but again, Legolas shouldn't have been there. The most obvious way the Lord of the Rings movies could have developed Legolas is through his relationship with Aragorn. Had Legolas shown any level of distrust or doubt in Aragorn before their argument in the Battle of Rohan, Legolas's apology would have been more poignant. It would have shown Legolas to be an imperfect and skeptical person who needed to learn to put his hope and faith into his friend. Alternatively, he could have wrestled with his own legacy as the son of Thranduil and come to terms with what responsibilities he may have to take on after the war. If he willingly took those responsibilities on, he could have been an example to Aragorn. Instead, Legolas befriends a dwarf and kills a lot of orcs. It's a testament to how incredible the movies are that, despite the hollowness of one of their main characters, they're still incredible works of art.
So you have come here for information? I have some for you. You're all going to die.
This might seem like a normal sequence from one of the highest grossing, most acclaimed fantasy epics of all time, but it's actually the reason for a rift between two of the film industry's most beloved professionals, Peter Jackson and Christopher Lee. One, a once-in-a-generation director with a long and very storied career. The other is one of the most iconic and celebrated actors ever. See, Jackson got to start making low-budget, avant-garde genre picks. Eventually, he would work his way up to the pinnacle of Hollywood filmmaking, while Lee, well, you might recognize him for his turns as either the immortal vampire Dracula or the Sith Lord in disguise, Count Dooku. However, film fans of a certain generation will undoubtedly pinpoint him as the dastardly white wizard Saruman in the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit trilogies. Despite being a well-known actor by multiple era of film watchers, Christopher Lee, the man, was a very private individual, better known as Sir Christopher Frank Carradine Lee. So what happened here with Lord of the Rings, well, might surprise some people. See, Lee the person served in various military capacities, both the Finnish army and the English Air Force prior to his career as a performer. In fact, he didn't even begin pursuing acting until he was about 40 years old. So what Lee did not anticipate, given not really being raised in the industry, is the gray areas of artistic collaboration. When making a movie, thousands of choices have to be made. Some as small as what color a character's jacket should be, others as large as whether a famous actor makes the final cut of a film, which is exactly what happened between Lee and Peter Jackson during the filming of Lord of the Rings. Christopher Lee was cast to play the iconic villain Saruman in the Lord of the Rings films. During the filming of the first two films, Lee and Jackson became quite close, according to, well, everyone around them. However, after the completion of The Two Towers, the filmmaking pair had a nasty falling out. Lee was incensed by what Jackson had done with his character in the climax of The Two Towers.
I was very cold about it.
I wasn't cold about it.
The 7-minute sequence was filmed in which Lee's character is ultimately defeated by the Fellowship and plunges to his death, becoming impaled on a spike of a dilapidated windmill. Despite the best of intentions from Jackson, running time for the sequence was deemed too long, which is ironic given the running time of the film. The sequence functions as a sneaky homage to one of the many deaths Lee's Dracula character suffered in his Hammer horror franchise 7-film run. This scene literally shows the death of the Fellowship's ultimate enemy. By the time the film saw theatrical release, however, this sequence was removed from that cut. At the time, Jackson said his intention was to have his reveal be the opening sequence of the next film in the series, The Return of the King. That was the explanation for the chopping of that scene on the cutting room floor. Jackson told Ain't It Cool News in 2003, the problem is the sequence was originally shot for The Two Towers, as it is in the book. Since The Two Towers couldn't sustain a 7-minute wrap-up after Helms Deep, we thought it would be a good idea to save it for the beginning of Return of the King. Trouble is, when we reviewed various Return of the King cuts over the last few weeks, it felt like the first scene wrapping up last year's movie instead of starting a new one. We felt it got Return of the King off to an uncertain beginning since Saruman plays no role in the events. We don't have the Shire like the book does, yet we dwell in Isengard for quite a long time before the story kicked off. Well, Christopher Lee didn't like that, and this reasoning did not comfort him at all.
I can't do it, Peter. I'm sorry.
From Lee's perspective, this was a massive betrayal. Was it within Jackson's contractual rights to do this? Of course. But Lee was decidedly unhappy with how this omission affected the finished film. He initially didn't like the idea of the climax of his character's arc being featured in the beginning of another film, but then became accustomed to the idea. However, upon hearing that his Saruman scene had been cut from Return of the King as well, well, he got a little more upset.
You have elected the way of pain!
He felt the Two Towers lacked an ending, and that with Saruman's death being taken out of Return of the King, his character was sent off without the respect he deserved, both personally, artistically, and fictionally. We were shown the films in private, and when the third film came on, I couldn't believe what I saw.
Because I wasn't in it.
Christopher Lee told the University of College Dublin in 2011. The show Saruman, the Fellowship's great mortal enemy, as the most evil of villains, on top of the tower, saying, well, very nasty things to them, to Aragorn.
This exile, crept from the shadows, will never be crowned king.
The final confrontation between the Fellowship and that greatest enemy.
It wasn't in the film.
No one could understand it. There were millions of hits on the internet. They all said the same thing. What happened to Saruman? Buy the extended DVD. Well, that was ultimately the solution that Jackson and company had landed on. They realized they could utilize the footage of Saruman and his final confrontation for an extended edition DVD product that would make a bunch of money. This solution angered Christopher Lee even more.
Here we go.
He felt that this was choosing commerce over artistic integrity. He felt that this decision was motivated solely by the potential for financial windfall, as opposed to what the story and fiction required. Now, it's worth pointing out that for the most part, these decisions are actually made by studios, not Peter Jackson. Regardless, this is one of the most difficult aspects of producing work collaboratively. A director has to balance not only what is best for the movie, but the various egos and personalities around the people involved with the project. And that includes the people at the studios that never take a step on set. In some ways, that's just as challenging as telling a good story. Christopher Lee was so upset at the outcome that he boycotted the premiere of Return of the King. He and Jackson didn't speak for a number of years, Jackson even admitting that he knew that Lee was very upset. However, eventually the two men would come back together, and they did, nearly a decade later. Peter Jackson was helming an expanded version of The Hobbit, which was being fleshed out into a full trilogy of films, which, is a whole different can of worms about why we tell stories concisely. Jackson invited Lee back into the fold, offering him an opportunity to reprise his role. Lee accepted and appeared in the film as the iconic magician. Eventually, Jackson did say that he talked to Christopher about coming to the premiere, and he said, "Am I still in the movie?" And this time I could say yes. Lord of the Rings was a Herculean effort by all counts. The films took nearly a decade of Peter Jackson's life, thousands of people, and a combined $300 million. And to be fair to everyone involved, the one complaint lodged towards the Lord of the Rings theatrical cuts is that they were a little bloated, which is ironic given a lot of fans now love the extended cuts even more, which are 3.5 to 4 hours long. Studios just don't expect the average moviegoer to go see a 3-hour movie. There are exceptions to this rule, but The Lord of the Rings was a risk to begin with, financially, for the people in suits. Thankfully, Jackson and Lee were amicable and reunited their friendship after some time, but this is never an easy situation to deal with, to be sure. But it's one that many creative people find themselves in, and it's one that every creative person needs to look inside and prepare for, because if you're attempting to produce work on any scale, let alone $1 billion in a decade of your life, this will happen. And the other thing you can do is try to be respectful to all parties and do what's right for the work. Understand your vision and compromise as long as your vision remains what you see. Be true to what you believe in, maybe not true to extended cut DVD sales, but listen along the way. Other people are smart, they have good ideas. Vision isn't narrow when you work with people you respect, and that vision will become the collaborative part of the process.
It's me! It's your Sam!
The Lord of the Rings is a story about an unlikely hero vanquishing an unimaginable evil by destroying a magic ring. It's a classic hero's journey, but we all know there's more to it than that. Starting with the fact that our hero is not the ring bearer, nor is it the steward who gives his life for the cause or the wizard who returns from the dead. It's not even the rightful king of the land. It's the gardener. And no, it's not just because he literally carried the plot on his back. As with the rest of the Lord of the Rings, there's more to Sam's heroism than that.
Don't you leave him, Samwise Gamgee. And I don't mean to.
When you think of Sam's most heroic moments in The Lord of the Rings, your mind probably goes to his battle with Shelob, his one-man siege on the Tower of Cirith Ungol, or his Oscar-worthy moment on Mount Doom. Or maybe you're a book purist and you think about that one time he yelled at a tree for trying to drown and suffocate his friends. The point is that Sam's heroic stunts are well known and well documented across both the books and the movies. If it weren't for his intervention at multiple points in the story, Frodo may well have died, or the ring could have easily been lost and the plan would have been in ruin. This willingness to run into danger makes him a valuable member of the Fellowship, and a perfect ward for Frodo, as he assumes the role of ring-bearer and hero of the tale. Or at least that's what we're led to believe. The truth of the matter is that Frodo is not the center of this story.
I don't usually hold with foreign food, but this elvish stuff, it's not bad.
Nothing ever dampens your spirits, does it, Sam?
Sam fills those roles of protagonist and hero more readily and more easily than Frodo or any other member of our fellowship. Surprisingly, the stunts he performs are the least important bit of evidence as to why. Sam's heroism actually has way more to do with who he is as a character and how the story is structured around him. So let's start from the beginning. The first time he's brought up in Tolkien's writing, we're told that Sam's father worked for Bilbo and Frodo as a gardener. While many other hobbits found the residents of Bag Inn to be odd and socially outcast, the Gamgees befriended them anyway. Bilbo even taught Sam to read, which is typically seen in Hobbiton as a peculiar hobby meant only for the wealthy. And when his father grew too old and tired to maintain Bag Inn's garden, Sam took up the responsibility of toiling away in the dirt. Though his name is only mentioned in passing, readers are given a strong sense of Sam's character in just those few short paragraphs. This is a young hobbit whose loyalty and kindness know no bounds, and he's also happy to quite literally get his hands dirty. As the story progresses, we learn he is much more quiet and shy than his compatriots. But when everyone around him gives up hope, Sam is there to pick up the slack with an almost naive amount of optimism.
Just a bit of seasoning. I thought maybe if we was having a roast chicken one night or something. Roast chicken? You never know.
Bilbo fills his head with adventure, and while he marvels at the idea of seeing elves one day, his oversized feet are planted firmly in the soil of his home. The idea of venturing beyond what is safe and known literally gives him pause.
If I take one more step, it'll be the farthest away from home I've ever been.
Until Frodo coaxes him forward, a role typically reserved for the mentor of a story, not the protagonist. Thanks to the brilliance of Peter Jackson, Philippa Boyens, and Fran Walsh, Sam's character remains largely consistent in the Lord of the Rings film trilogy. Played by the immensely talented Sean Astin, Sam retains all of his base elements from the books. His optimism, his modesty, and most importantly, his loyalty are all there in full force. To his credit, Sean Astin really became Sam. In his early interviews, both Astin and Elijah Wood talk about their on-set bond and how Astin would often take care of Wood whenever he needed help. That friendship really shows up on screen, and it helps to carry the story and strengthen the hearts of both characters. As an audience, we feel it more deeply when Sam asserts himself over the powerful people at the Council of Elrond, or when he risks drowning in order to get to Frodo, or when he's sent away after fighting with Gollum only to return of his own volition to bravely rescue his friend. This is a bashful and unassuming hobbit who becomes the bravest member of the Fellowship when faced with the possibility of losing his friends. So, by the time we get to Sam's speech to Frodo at the foot of Mount Doom, we've come to see him as much more than the Ring-Bearer's faithful guardian. While Sam looks around at the impossible situation they've found themselves in and looks down at his nearly unconscious friend, he speaks of his home. He reminds Frodo of the natural beauty of the Shire and the taste of strawberries. And still, Frodo is ready to give up. That's when we get what is quite possibly the most iconic line in the entire franchise.
I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you!
As Sam carries his friend to what they both believe to be their demise, we are reminded of how far he has come through all of this. He was content with his place in the world, a simple gardener with distant and unattainable dreams of adventure, looking for nothing more than a simmering pot over a fire. And yet, he left his idyllic home, experienced the wonder and majesty of the elves firsthand, suffered through extraordinary hardships, and when he had no more strength left, he still persisted, all for the love of his friends. In this way, Sam represents the themes of The Lord of the Rings better than any other character in the series. His loyalty and love for his companions, his unwavering optimism in the face of world-ending threats, and his humble status as a simple gardener enforce Tolkien's main points, that friendship and fellowship are paramount. True power comes from strength of character, and life is worth living.
But there's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo. And it's worth fighting for.
This alone would make for a strong case to call Sam the hero of the story, but we're not done yet, because we haven't even gotten to the end of our tale. If not for Sam, Sauron's forces would have overtaken Middle-earth, and all the goodness and beauty of the world would have been snuffed out. Instead, because of the strength of a single hobbit, everyone gets their happy ending. Bilbo and Frodo go into the west with Gandalf, Galadriel, and Elrond. Arwen marries Aragorn, who is crowned king of Gondor. Gimli and Legolas are there, and the rest of the hobbits get to return to their lives. So ends Sam's hero's journey, the one he began by leaving the Shire, taking on supernatural challenges, defeating an ultimate evil, and returning home forever changed. Obviously, several members of the Fellowship follow their own hero's journey over the course of The Lord of the Rings. This is especially true in the movies, where the story's conflict is dialed up to 11. Aragorn goes from rejecting his birthright to becoming king. Frodo's journey most closely mirrors Sam, yet he's framed as the protagonist because of his possession of the ring. But it's really Sam's story. It's Sam's actions that drove the plot forward. It was Sam's character who best embodied the themes of the story and grew from his original shy demeanor into a brave adventurer. And at the end of both the books and the movies, it's Sam who we follow home to Hobbiton. His face, his words, and his loving family are the notes we go out on. Because Sam is our hero, he's our protagonist. And if you've sat through this whole video and still find yourself disagreeing, maybe Tolkien himself will convince you, since he also considered Sam to be the chief hero of The Lord of the Rings, as expressed in one of his many letters. I think the simple, rustic love of Sam and his Rosie, nowhere elaborated, is absolutely essential to the study of the chief hero's character, and to the theme of the relation of ordinary life, breathing, eating, working, begetting, and quests, sacrifice, causes, and the longing for elves, and sheer beauty. But I will say no more.
Whatever you did, you've been officially labeled a disturber of the peace.
This is Frodo Baggins, as played by Elijah Wood, but you already knew that. Becoming one of the most recognizable pop culture icons that ever existed might seem like a gift, but it's a heavy burden. Very few manage to escape the looming shadow of their most popular roles, but hobbitses are sneaky, and Wood slipped out from under the crushing weight of pigeonholing in some surprisingly clever ways.
And you are? I'm the guy. The real guy.
The Lord of the Rings franchise is a beast of an unimaginable size on our pop culture landscape. From the quaint original Hobbit story to the blockbuster movies to the video games and television series, the road goes ever on and on for Tolkien's work. By far, the most successful of these ventures has been Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy, which plucked several young actors out of relative obscurity and turned them into superstars practically overnight. One of these actors was 18-year-old Elijah Wood, though obscure might be the wrong word to describe him. While he's unmistakably tethered to the role of the ring bearer, Wood actually started his career as a fairly prolific child actor, appearing in everything from music videos to the second Back to the Future film.
You mean you have to use your hands? That's like a baby's toy.
He co-starred alongside Macaulay Culkin in The Good Son, a creepy psychological thriller, and made less of a splash in the unmemorable disaster movie Deep Impact. Wood's early filmography was eclectic, and that certainly helped differentiate him from other actors looking to be cast as Frodo Baggins, like Jake Gyllenhaal. But what really pushed him over the edge was his audition tape. Wood decided to go all out for his audition, as he told Esquire in 2021.
There was something about this particular film that I wanted to do something different that would stand out above everything else.
Donning a costume and gathering his friends together, Wood shot several scenes from the Lord of the Rings book over a single day. Cutting down those scenes that same night and recording them onto a VHS tape, Wood submitted his physical audition tape to the casting office. This wasn't exactly common practice at the time, but Wood followed his instincts and trusted that his unorthodox methods would pay off. Obviously, they did.
I think I have a copy, buried somewhere in a box of VHS tape.
For most, this would seem like a happy ending. A young actor was cast in the role of a lifetime. Wood played Frodo with a perfect balance of innocence and bravery in the face of impossible odds. He held his own in scenes opposite incredible talents, and he built a legacy for himself over a trilogy of near-perfect movies. But this wasn't the end of Wood's story.
All right, then, keep your secrets. Good. But I know you have something to do with it.
Much like Frodo returning to the Shire upon destroying the One Ring, after Return of the King was released in 2003, the 22-year-old had to ask himself one very important question. What now? There are many paths Wood could have taken himself down, and most would have been less than ideal for an actor with so much potential. He could have easily allowed himself to fall into the trap of reliving his glory days, relying on the rabid fandom that has only grown since his first appearance as Frodo. He could have let himself be typecast as a wholesome fantasy creature for the rest of his career. He could have disappeared into the night and retired in some far-off paradise, never to be heard from again.
Wow, a lot to unpack there.
Instead, the first project Wood found himself in post-Rings was Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind.
Maybe I should invite my girlfriend over. I have a girlfriend now.
Do whatever you want.
Sporting a shaved head, facial hair, and dressed in modern clothing, Wood immediately separated himself from the iconic image of a hairy-footed hobbit. And the character of Patrick Wirtz was certainly different than what he had become known for in The Lord of the Rings.
I stole a pair of her panties is what. It's not like, I mean, they were clean and all.
Citing his interest in director Michel Gondry's early music videos, Wood knew he wanted to be involved in Eternal Sunshine from the very beginning. You could say his eclectic tastes had followed him into adulthood, and that trend would only continue. Wood essentially made his mission to work with creatives he looked up to on projects he found genuinely interesting. He took the part of Kevin in Sin City because he was a fan of the graphic novels the movie was adapted from. He fronted Liev Schreiber's directorial debut, Everything is Illuminated, because it was very different than anything he'd ever done. He committed to 4 years of being licked by a man in a dog costume because
Wilfred was this crazy amalgam of really weird, super funny, also it had heart.
And he played a cold-blooded killer and maniac because he was a fan of the director's first film, the controversial, ultra-violent, High Tension. Even still, he couldn't quite shake off the role that made him famous.
I wish the ring had never come to me.
In an interview with The Guardian in 2013, Wood had this to say about his work after The Lord of the Rings. When Maniac was first announced, all the references in the press were to Frodo. Yet that was 8 years ago. I've worked on a bunch of vastly different movies since then. I guess what it showed is that Frodo's never going away. Wood was right in a lot of ways, but the good news is that while he remains heavily associated with The Lord of the Rings, he has also carved out a rich and varied career in the 11 years since that Guardian interview. The choices he made directly after his stint as Frodo may not have completely broken him free of the Ring's influence, but they demonstrated his willingness to try new and strange things. He dipped into horror comedies with Come to Daddy, and more recently he became a hugely popular character on Showtime's thriller TV series, Yellow Jackets.
What's with the boat?
Nautical life calls to me. Plus, I hate bureaucratic red tape. You never know when you might need to leave the country sans passport.
And if it ever gets a wide release, we'll get to see him channel Danny DeVito's Penguin in the 2023 reimagining of The Toxic Avenger. But perhaps the most important and least known part of Wood's career is the work he's doing behind the camera. Founding a production company called Spectre Vision, Wood has been helping to crank out cult hits at a mid-range budget, a virtually unheard of practice in modern Hollywood. While the production company's most popular titles are the Nicolas Cage vehicles Mandy and Color Out of Space, Spectre Vision has continued to produce interesting and challenging films that range from cynical Swedish sci-fi to high-octane superhero mysteries.
Maybe I'm just a bored Moriarty looking for his Sherlock.
Giving writers and directors the freedom to do something weird on more than a shoestring budget is a worthwhile endeavor, and it's no surprise that Wood is at the heart of the idea. Due to his wide array of projects that span an unending list of genres, he has become something of a wild card.
It's pretty rare to have a friend who's relentlessly got your back.
Those same instincts and unorthodox methods that got him cast in The Lord of the Rings have continued to serve him well since. And though he has suffered some serious misses with projects like Green Street Hooligans and The Last Witch Hunter, his inclinations toward the unusual keep his IMDb page from sinking into mediocrity. And now he's turning those instincts toward other creators and giving them enough runway to launch their own projects with his production company.
Me? No. No, I definitely don't do brave stuff. Like, I've never even been camping.
When it comes down to it, Wood has always had an eye for the artfully weird. His continued interest in niche projects, both as an actor and a producer, means that he can use his post-Rings wealth and influence to make the film landscape just a little more fun. Rather than sitting on a dragon's hoard of cash, Wood has essentially been throwing the party of a lifetime and handing out gifts to those who come calling. His name and face on an indie movie will certainly draw attention, and his production company's money behind an unknown director's first movie will make someone's dream come true. So, he may never be completely free of the burden of Frodo Baggins, but he has found a way to share the load. And that might actually be a better end to his story.
It's done. It's over now.
I was hanging by a thread of my arm for so long that at the end of the day, you have to cut it off.
Iconic director Guillermo del Toro's struggle to get The Hobbit made is the stuff of legends at this point. Never has there been a more perfect match of filmmaker and source material, and yet it wasn't enough. From studio bankruptcies and behind-the-scenes frictions to the lawsuits around realities of business, tragically, The Hobbit, directed by Guillermo del Toro, was just never meant to be. The Lord of the Rings, directed by Peter Jackson, is looked at by many as the greatest trilogy in the Western film canon. Produced by New Line Cinema and almost 4 years of prep time prior to cameras rolling, each film was constructed with care, attention to detail, and loving reverence to the novels they were adapted from. With the trilogy's legacy gaining momentum every day, it was only natural that the Hollywood players would be working behind the scenes to recreate this success, to engineer a second trip into Middle-earth. Only problem was that it was going to be a very bumpy ride.
I'm going on an adventure!
The Hobbit had actually been Jackson's first goal for adaptation. As early as 1995, Jackson and co-writer Fran Walsh had envisioned a trilogy that would include The Hobbit as the first film, and the second 2 films being Lord of the Rings Part 1 and 2. This version of the franchise caused the rights of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings to become muddied and bound in different production entities. At one point, Miramax ended up with The Lord of the Rings rights, and producer Saul Zaentz, backed by MGM and United Artists, ended up with The Hobbit. When New Line eventually ended up producing the trilogy, they could only adapt Fellowship, Two Towers, and Return, and had to remove The Hobbit from their plans entirely. So after the release of the Ring films, The Hobbit would be the next logical step. Only problem being that MGM, not New Line, had the rights until the far distant year of 2010. 7 whole years after the global smash success of the trilogy sweeping the Oscars. This and the fact that in March of 2005, Jackson launched a lawsuit against New Line. He claimed they had not paid him residuals for the revenue generated by merchandising, video games, and home video sales. Understandably, this muddied the water if Jackson would be involved in any more productions centered around Middle-earth.
But it did leave us with the issue of, okay, so what now?
In December of 2007, after a fractious back and forth between Jackson and New Line, a joint press release was issued. Jackson would return to the fold and produce The Hobbit and an untitled sequel, which would be co-financed and co-produced by New Line and MGM. However, just a few short months later, in February of 2008, things started to get rocky on 2 fronts. The Tolkien estate sued HarperCollins, the publisher of the Rings books, and New Line Cinema for breaching a contract for lack of proper residuals, as well as a merger between Warner Brothers and New Line, which would add a third major studio to the mix of companies involved in the production of The Hobbit. It was amidst the backdrop of lawsuits, high-stakes fan interest, and corporate mergers that Guillermo del Toro was hired onto the project.
Guillermo del Toro was one of our favorite filmmakers, and in our mind, he was a director that would do a really interesting version of The Hobbit.
Pre-production for The Hobbit began in August, with del Toro working with almost all of the creative crew that built the Rings movies. From production designer to prop makers, almost everyone was getting back into the saddle, especially the core creative brain trust that wrote the highly acclaimed scripts for the films, Jackson, Walsh, and Philippa Boyens. They all agreed to work with del Toro to craft his vision of what The Hobbit would be. During the research process for the films, del Toro developed a take that would be honorific to the book, but also expand on it in quintessentially del Toro ways. Del Toro viewed Tolkien as being influenced by his time in the trenches during World War I when writing The Hobbit. Del Toro wanted to mine that energy and aesthetic for the first film in his duology. He devised a plan that would have the first of the 2 films be a darker, more whimsical affair, something fueled by del Toro's own gothic preoccupations and obsessions with monsters and revenge. The second film, which would follow that back half of the book's story, would be more of a bridge to the style and aesthetic that Jackson had established for the original trilogy. By March of 2009, the crew had their working drafts and del Toro had moved to New Zealand. He was working with artists and designers to craft his vision. He had a rigorous schedule of writing with the Creative Brain Trust from 8:30 a.m. to 3 p.m., and then he would make his way to the Weta workshop where he would have copious meetings with the designers and craft people who were building the numerous costumes and sets required for the epic story. Concept artists John Howe and Alan Lee, who both worked on the original trilogy, were brought back and tasked with developing the look of the film. Additionally, comic book artists from Hellboy creator Mike Mignola was brought in to design monsters and gothic castles. The Guillermo del Toro version of The Hobbit would have seen some familiar faces, who ended up in the finished product, but they would have appeared drastically different. Chief amongst the alternative versions might be Azog, the albino orc, who is a central antagonist in the existing films. In the del Toro version, he would have not been a CGI-rendered performance. He would have been a fully practical suit, much like Lurtz in The Fellowship of the Ring. Del Toro wanted a keenly physical presence for the film, so that the large-scale CGI Smaug would be countered by a more personal and tactile threat for Bilbo and the dwarves to contend with. Judging from this concept art and costume camera test image we have, it would have been a very different experience. Smaug as well would have a much different appearance, with Del Toro repeatedly stating that he wanted him to have a mouth that would move like a human's. Much of Del Toro's scripts and approach has still not been revealed due to NDAs. However, things were about to take a turn for the maestro of genre cinema.
We began writing with Guillermo, and that was wonderful, but unfortunately, we had no green light.
MGM, one of the vital partners in the production, was plunging into bankruptcy. After a string of poor business decisions, the studio's future was hanging in the balance. Creditors were poised to take over as much as 95% of the company's assets under a wide-reaching financial restructuring agreement. The decision from the studio was made to delay production of The Hobbit while still remaining committed to eventually producing the film. This wasn't good enough for Del Toro. He had spent close to 2 years preparing the twin projects to be shot simultaneously, and now, with the studio potentially not even going to be a functioning entity, he was faced with a choice: walk or try to wait out an indefinite hiatus from a company actively engaged in bankruptcy negotiations with the court. Ultimately, he chose to cut and run. When asked if the production could move forward sans MGM, Del Toro said, "It wasn't just MGM. These are very complicated movies, economically and politically."
It doesn't get harder than that. I mean, it's the hardest decision I've ever taken. I have incredible heartache. I feel terrible about it.
Tragically, a morass of rights issues, near studio bankruptcy, and external lawsuits caused the Del Toro version of The Hobbit to evaporate into thin air. Instead, a mere month and a half after the announcement that Del Toro was leaving, it was reported that Peter Jackson would be returning to the director's chair, with an eye on turning the two films into another epic trilogy.
In terms of Guillermo's designs, I looked at it and I thought this would be an amazing Guillermo del Toro film.
However, in an equally cruel twist of the knife, the studio, newly rescued from bankruptcy court, wanted the films as quickly as possible. The Del Toro scripts were scrapped and rewritten from the ground up, now with an expanded cast of characters who were not in Tolkien's original novel.
Because Guillermo del Toro had to leave and I sort of jumped in and took over, we didn't wind the clock back 1.5 years and give me 1.5 years prep to design the movie I was going to make.
Due to the pressure to get the newly titled The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey into theaters by December 6th of 2012, everything had to be done immediately. As opposed to 4 years of prep time on the original trilogy, the new trilogy would be prepared in just 3 months, all while Jackson was still finishing his animated epic, The Adventures of Tintin. Ultimately, this rush and feverish attempt at delivering the film on a deadline can be felt in almost every aspect of the finished product. It's easy to understand why the film feels undercooked. Jackson has repeatedly said on some days he was just making things up as they needed. If Jackson had been given more time, the projects could have been great, but they're not. It's a story we hear over and over again, creativity being hamstrung and boxed in by studio mandates, and a futile attempt to meet release dates to show growth to shareholders. The Hobbit films, both versions of them, had a virtual army of people working to make them good. But ultimately, you can't fight City Hall or the studio system.
I do believe the worst is behind us.
I'm going on an adventure!
This is the Hobbit movie trilogy. A trilogy of action-packed fantasy films directed by Peter Jackson might sound pretty good, but the Hobbit trilogy actually has a lot of problems. And there's no better way to talk about those problems than to see them in action during the barrel scene in 2013's Desolation of Smaug. Based on the beloved children's fantasy story of the same name, the Hobbit movie trilogy dominated a large chunk of nerd culture between 2012 and 2014, made a dragon's hoard worth of money, and enraged quite a few Tolkien fans. Leading up to Unexpected Journey's release in 2012, we already knew that production had been cursed with studio interference, the loss of a director, and intense pressure to deliver a finished product within an impossibly short amount of time. What was originally pitched as a 2-movie deal directed by Guillermo del Toro eventually snowballed into a trilogy of films more akin to The Lord of the Rings in terms of scope. Oh, and Peter Jackson was back to direct. Jackson did pull off the greatest book-to-film adaptations of all time with his Lord of the Rings trilogy, so why couldn't he do the same with The Hobbit? Well, for starters, The Hobbit is a single book made for children, one with 95,000 words. The Lord of the Rings novels are a more mature trilogy, weighing in at a little over 480,000 words. To put it bluntly, the decision to make The Hobbit into 3 movies, each with a theatrical runtime of over 2 hours, was completely asinine. According to Peter Jackson, the decision to chop up and overstuff The Hobbit into a trilogy was a creative one made in order to give Bilbo's unexpected journey the same amount of respect and time as Frodo and the story of The Lord of the Rings. Though if you're a tinfoil hat theory crafter, you may be more keen to think that the studios pressured Del Toro and later Jackson to wring out as much money as they possibly could from this multi-million-dollar endeavor.
It's ours!
But the fact that the Hobbit movies are a trilogy instead of a duology is only the beginning of their problems. And to address them all, we've got to talk about the barrel scene. Bilbo Baggins and his band of dwarves are captured by elves after getting lost in Mirkwood Forest on their way to the Lonely Mountain, where Thorin Oakenshield aims to reclaim his home and kill the dragon that guards it. After Thorin and Thranduil get into a where was Gondor type of argument, the dwarves are imprisoned, but Bilbo's quick wit and magic ring help him evade capture. He formulates a plan to smuggle the dwarves out in old wine barrels, and the adventuring party floats downstream towards Lake Town. That much is in both the book and the movie, but Desolation's version of the barrel scene takes things a little further. Once Bilbo and the dwarves start heading down the river, it becomes clear that we're in for a lot of action. First, we're introduced to some Disneyland-level rapids and waterfalls as the elves fight to recapture their prisoners. The elves close a gate, blocking the only path Bilbo and the dwarves had to freedom, and draw their sword for a fight, but they are interrupted by a group of orcs who growl directly into camera. This is where the real fight begins. It becomes a mad dash to open the gate and escape further downriver, while tens of orcs flock to the scene with the movie-only character of Bolg leading the charge. The elves, dwarves, and Bilbo must fight together against this new threat that kills multiple faceless extras. Keely is shot with an arrow, but ultimately saved by yet another movie-only character, Tauriel, the lowly Sylvan elf. Legolas arrives on the scene as well, doing what Legolas does best, while the rest of the party remains unscathed, shockingly so at times. We get to see more whitewater rafting with some weirdly out-of-place GoPro shots as well as more elven action. And then this. Arguably the most cartoonish and baffling sequence in the entire trilogy, and yes, that includes Legolas's fancy footwork a mere 15 seconds later. Eventually, Legolas does away with the remainder of the orcs and watches Bilbo and the dwarves float away. So, in the interest of fairness, let's address the elephant in the room. There is a lot to critique about the Hobbit trilogy, and that doesn't mean that they're all bad. There is some great stuff in these movies. Pretty much everything about Gollum, for example, and the riddles in the dark sequence, Benedict Cumberbatch's Smaug, and Bilbo's first interaction with him, and of course, Martin Freeman's portrayal of Bilbo Baggins. Absolute perfection.
You don't have one? A home? It was taken from you, but I will help you take it back if I can.
But the bad is really bad. One of the worst and most obvious problems with the whole Hobbit trilogy is its inconsistent tone. What might have been a duology tone in a more traditional fairy tale style under Del Toro was transformed. It had to chase the success and grand tone of the Lord of the Rings movies while trying and mostly failing to inject some sort of childlike whimsy of the Hobbit book. Just in Desolation's barrel scene, we get moments where Legolas and Tauriel are fighting off leagues of orcs, single-handedly. Alongside bouncing baby Bomber, it's total chaos. Had the movies stuck to the original feel of the book they were based on, this might have been a fun scene. Taken out of context, it is. It's well choreographed and imaginative, but then you remember that this is part of a self-serious trilogy intended to mirror the epic tone of The Lord of the Rings. The whole trilogy had moments of tonal dissonance like this, but the barrel scene is particularly guilty. That's not to say these movies shouldn't have jokes or lighter moments in them. Jackson's Lord of the Rings managed to find the balance.
What's taters? Potatoes. Boil them, mash them, stick them in a stew.
But it's a matter of what, and especially when. Which brings us to our next pervasive issue, weird pacing. The barrel scene spans nearly 10 minutes of Desolation's 2-hour and 41-minute runtime, and the fast-paced action is kept up for the entire duration. But while the scene itself may be paced well, it's emblematic of the trilogy's pacing problem because it's an entirely needless addition to the movie. Remember when they killed off Smaug in the prologue of the third film and then spent entirely too much time giving us slow-mo Thorin Oakenshield going mad from dragon sickness? Or the long plot pause we got to watch Keely flirt with Tauriel in Desolation? The barrel scene is just another example. Did we need 10 minutes devoted to a completely unnecessary action scene that did nothing to advance the plot? No. Actually, throughout the entire series, so much attention is paid to big action set pieces that character development and story gets totally sidelined. And when we do get character development, it's usually from a character that shouldn't have been there in the movies in the first place, except for Bard. Making Bard an actual character was a good move, even if he spends a lot of time with Alfred, who is one of many unnecessary characters that make an appearance in these movies.
Rome, it's the master's business, which makes it my business.
Desolation's barrel scene is absolutely chock full of characters that should have not been in the Hobbit movies, or at least not in their current forms. Tauriel, Bolg, and yes, even Legolas take up so much screen time and bring little to nothing to the actual story. Apparently, there was some form of the script which had a lot more to do with the dwarves and their individual personalities. But that idea was shelved somewhere along the way, which is a pity, as in their stead, we got an awkward love triangle, a cowardly assistant, and orc daddy issues. A more cohesive story and fleshed out characters definitely would have helped the trilogy, but it wouldn't fix its reliance on misguided special effects or its strange aesthetic. The trilogy was mostly filmed on a camera designed to shoot in 48 frames per second rather than the industry standard 24. It makes the world of The Hobbit look unnaturally smooth and blurry. That, along with some extremely fake-looking moments and the unreal overall style of the movies, makes those low-quality GoPro shots in the rapids that much more jarring. Peter Jackson announced that 2 movies would be split into 3 on July 30th of 2012, just months before the first film was set to release in December of 2012. Since the next 2 movies were slated for 2013 and 2014, this meant some dramatic reshoots, rewrites, and reworks. Jackson was literally writing the script of each movie while on set. Sets, costumes, and props were being finished on the day they were needed. Compare that to the years of pre-production that went into The Lord of the Rings, and it's easy to see why the Hobbit movies ended up the way that they did. While the creative minds behind the project were largely the same as those who worked on The Lord of the Rings, there just wasn't enough time or consideration put into The Hobbit to make it truly great.
The world is not in your books and maps. It's out there.
Now, none of this is to say that they should have followed the book by the letter. The Lord of the Rings trilogy made changes to its source material, and they're better for it. But the Hobbit movies swung so far in the wrong direction that they are almost unrecognizable.
My friends, you bow to no one.
The Lord of the Rings trilogy has a near-perfect ending. Considering it eats up about 30 minutes of Return of the King's runtime, you might assume Peter Jackson packed everything he could into the end of the film. And yet, there's one glaring omission that book readers have been debating over for 2 decades. One that would have completely altered the themes of the Lord of the Rings trilogy.
Here, at last, on the shores of the sea, comes the end of our fellowship.
We've sung their praises and lauded Peter Jackson, Philippa Boyens, and Fran Walsh as stellar creative talents. And why wouldn't we? The film franchise is held in high regard for countless reasons. Jackson and his cohorts have a reverence for J.R.R. Tolkien that's apparent across practically every frame of the Lord of the Rings movies. Sure, some changes were made. Overall, though, the world and stories of Middle-earth remain remarkably intact. The creative team went to great lengths to make sure that was the case. When fans came out of theaters after watching Return of the King in 2003, some of them were left with one question. If Jackson, Boyens, and Walsh were so committed to telling Tolkien's story, why would they leave out an important chapter right at the end?
What does he mean?
That important chapter is, of course, the Scouring of the Shire. The moment the hobbits find the Shire has been overtaken by evil. To answer why it wasn't included in the final moments of the movie, we first have to look at what was.
I know what it is you saw, for it is also in my mind.
In the theatrical and extended editions of The Lord of the Rings: Return of the King, our intrepid group of hobbits goes back to the Shire after Aragorn is crowned King of Gondor. Their home has been untouched by war, their people have been oblivious to the world-ending threat on their doorstep, and all's right with the world. For everyone except Frodo, that is. Feeling restless and physically pained after experiencing the horrors of his journey, Frodo opts to go with Gandalf and Bilbo to the Grey Havens. His friends accompany him to the boat where they say their tearful goodbyes before watching the ring-bearer sail off into the west. We end with Sam coming home to his family and saying one final line.
Well, I'm back.
Most of this is similar to what happens in the book. After destroying the ring, Aragorn has his coronation. Everyone celebrates, the hobbits head home, and Frodo makes for the Grey Havens shortly after. The book even ends with the exact same line from Sam, but there's one major difference. The Shire has not actually remained untouched. Over the few months, the whole place was turned upside down under the direction of a mysterious crime boss named Sharky. The fields are being burned. Ugly buildings have been erected all over the land, and men from the south rule over the hobbits by force. Frodo and his friends don't take any of this lightly, of course. They rally the other hobbits against the men and face down Sharky and his right hand, who turn out to be none other than a powerless Saruman and Wormtongue. Just like in Two Towers, it's Wormtongue who takes Saruman down after an argument, and then Wormtongue is subsequently riddled with arrows by unnamed hobbits. And that's it. Sam and the other hobbits restore their home, and everything goes back to normal before Frodo finally decides to go to the Undying Lands.
You finished it. Not quite. There's room for a little more.
If you've never read The Lord of the Rings, you might be a bit confused as to why any of this happens. Why would Tolkien choose to make the penultimate chapter of his fantasy series a depressing battle with a powered-down version of one of the main villains, especially after all the main conflicts have been resolved? Over the decades, several theories have sprouted up. The most obvious for the chapter's existence is just to show how far our characters have come as people. Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin all get to show off their newfound bravery and leadership skills during the Scouring, further proving how they've been forever changed by their experiences. Some readers believe that the purpose of the Scouring of the Shire was to demonstrate that war is far-reaching, and nowhere is safe from the ugliness of conflict. Not even havens like the Shire. The most pervasive theory is that the Scouring of the Shire is an allegory for the state of England at the end of World War II. But Tolkien famously hated allegory and even pushed back on this idea in the foreword for the second edition of Return of the King, saying, "It has been supposed by some that the Scouring of the Shire reflects the situation in England at the time when I finished my tale. It does not." Well, I guess that clears that up. He would go on to say that, if anything, the Scouring of the Shire was somewhat inspired by his youth, as he watched the countryside he grew up in be slowly overtaken by industry.
The old world will burn in the fires of industry. The forests will fall.
Whatever the reason for its inclusion in the book, the Scouring is an important aspect of Tolkien's story. It's a part of the history of the Shire, and it depicts the death of Saruman, which infamously was not included at all in the theatrical cut of Return of the King. And yet, Jackson was unwilling to put the Scouring on screen.
We did pay homage to it in the Fellowship of the Ring. When Frodo looks into Galadriel's mirror, he sees exactly the imagery from the Scouring of the Shire.
He, Boyens, and Walsh knew from the beginning that it wasn't going to make it into the movie. It was never shot, and as far as we know, it was never in the script at all.
To sort of deviate into a completely different event and storyline, to me, felt anticlimactic, I guess is what I'd describe it.
Which makes sense. Jackson's version of The Lord of the Rings is a grand tale of massive scope. Suddenly pivoting to a bunch of hobbits enacting guerrilla warfare on a group of invaders would have been in direct opposition to the solemn and epic tone of the film up to that point, especially when followed up by that emotional final scene.
You can't start up the story again, not after nearly 9 hours of storytelling, which I know people are going to find ironic given the ending that is on this movie.
Return of the King is also known as a movie that simply refuses to end. There are several fade-to-black fake-outs that just give way to more scenes. This multiple ending phenomenon was one Jackson and his team recognized, but it was mostly unavoidable. Even though the Scouring only takes up a few pages of the book, it could have represented tens of additional minutes of runtime and several days of shooting. But the most poignant reason for excluding the Scouring of the Shire from Return of the King actually comes from the DVD commentary track for the movie. Jackson talks at length about the scene where our four hobbits sit together in a busy pub, while everyone around them is blissfully unaware of the dangers that very nearly broke down their doors. Jackson felt that this was a necessary theme to touch on, particularly because Tolkien had been a soldier in the First World War.
One of the things that just about all veterans of the First World War talk about is a sense of coming home to their families, and they've been thoroughly changed by the experience.
It's a quiet scene with no dialogue. Instead, the hobbits glance around the room at all the smiling, happy faces, and give each other knowing glances before downing their drinks. They're home, but they've changed, and no one will ever understand the trauma they underwent. As Jackson put it,
I wanted that feeling amongst those four guys that they were there, but no one else knew how heroic they really were.
It's both a hopeful and heartbreaking message that perfectly fits into the ending of Jackson's Return of the King. The Scouring of the Shire, on the other hand, is a pretty sour note to end on. Sam even goes as far as to say, it's worse than Mordor. After everything the hobbits went through, coming home to more destruction may be a more realistic depiction of the effects of war, but it drastically undercuts the theme of hope that's so important to the story overall. Life moves forward. The road goes ever on, and good wins over evil as long as there are heroes to fight it. It's important to show audiences that even when you're facing unspeakable horrors, there are still things in this world that are safe and good and worth protecting, even if they don't know you're protecting them. Jackson, Boyens, and Walsh understood this, and they were right to cut the Scouring of the Shire in favor of the scenes we ultimately got in Return of the King.
Other people are going to complain about the absence of Tom Bombadil. Sad, yes, but I mean, this could go on and on and on and on and on.
Whether you are a book purist or you've only watched the movies, you've heard of the name Tom Bombadil. Despite only appearing in a few short chapters at the start of Frodo's journey, Bombadil has become as legendary in our world as he is in Middle-earth. That legend largely comes from everything we don't know about him. Namely, who is he? What is he? And most importantly, why was he left out of Peter Jackson's adaptations?
All right, then, keep your secrets.
If you're only vaguely familiar with Tolkien's work, you might be wondering why Tom Bombadil is such a big deal for fans. You probably know him best as an ever-present meme, though he originated in one of Tolkien's poems from before the publication of The Lord of the Rings. He has essentially become a mascot for the franchise and gets brought up in conversation whenever anyone talks about the differences between Jackson's rings and their source material. Some people see his non-existence in the movies as a serious offense. Others are glad he never made it to the screen, and more still, would prefer to forget he exists completely. No matter which side of the debate you're on, it's worth exploring why Jackson and his writing partners, Philippa Boyens and Fran Walsh, decided to omit him. Luckily for us, Jackson actually addressed the matter in the DVD appendices for The Fellowship of the Ring.
The plot of The Lord of the Rings, in our movie, in its most simple form, is Frodo carrying the ring. What does Tom Bombadil ultimately really have to do with the ring? I know there's ring stuff in the Bombadil episode, but it's not really advancing our story and not really telling us things that we need to know.
So that's what Jackson has to say about Tom Bombadil, but is it accurate? Well, partially. It can't be denied that Tom Bombadil has major implications for the world of Middle-earth and the story Tolkien was telling. Whether those implications were necessary or even sensible is another matter entirely, and they could only be judged by looking at his actions in the book. Readers are first introduced to Tom Bombadil in the Old Forest chapter of The Fellowship of the Ring, when he rescues Frodo and the other hobbits from the clutches of Old Man Willow, a sentient tree that tries to drown and smother them in their sleep. Their journey may have ended there if not for Bombadil, who shows up singing a merry song and beats Old Man Willow with his own branches until he releases them. From there, Bombadil invites the hobbits to his whimsical cottage in the Old Forest, where they meet his wife, Goldberry the River Daughter, who's described as looking like a fair young elf queen, clad in living flowers. Altogether, Frodo and his friends spend 3 chapters with Bombadil and Goldberry, and every paragraph feels like a pleasantly bizarre fever dream. Their hosts appear more like benevolent woodland spirits than actual people, supplying the hobbits with ample food, rest, and song, while telling them vague and magical stories about themselves and the world around them.
Far-off tales and children's stories, that's all that is. You're beginning to sound like that old Bilbo Baggins.
Even the house itself is a kind of safe haven from the evils of the world, with an unseen barrier surrounding it and protecting those within. In one of the more pertinent moments, Frodo shows the One Ring to Bombadil, and instead of succumbing to its influence, he twirls the ring around his finger and performs a magic trick with it. When Frodo dons the ring, Bombadil can still see him, which tells readers that he's totally immune to its powers. Later, the hobbits get lost in an ancient graveyard called the Barrow Downs and are kidnapped by a wight. Bombadil once again comes to their rescue by banishing the wight and lifting the spell they were under. He saves their lives and encourages them to take a treasure from the wight's hoard. Each hobbit selects a sword that they carry with them throughout their journey. From there, Bombadil guides the hobbits to the edge of his property, directs them to the prancing pony and Bree, and then returns home to his wife. And that's pretty much it. He gets brought up to the Council of Elrond to confirm what we already know. Bombadil is a strange and ancient being with immunity to the ring's power, but he, for whatever reason, won't help in the quest to destroy it.
I would use this ring from a desire to do good, but through me, it would wield a power too great and terrible to imagine.
At the end of Return of the King, we're told Gandalf goes to visit him at his house. We don't get any details of that meeting, and he's never mentioned again. So as you probably noticed from some of the footage we've been using, Tom Bombadil into live action isn't an easy feat. Very few productions have been brave enough to attempt it, with the 1991 teleplay from Russia and the 9-part Finnish adaptation from 1993 being the two most well-known. With that in mind, the argument can be made that the Russian and Finnish adaptations are more faithful than Jackson's, but does following Tolkien's words to the letter make them a superior product? Putting aside the stark difference in resources and the frankly hilarious costuming and effects, the answer is obviously no. When putting a book on the screen, you have to make some concessions for the sake of the medium, and streamlining the narrative is an expected part of the process. To put it lightly, Tom Bombadil is a mystery. To put it more bluntly, he's almost totally nonsensical. His chapters feel oddly out of place. Even in the context of Tolkien's largely fantastical story, they're a strange, surreal stopover that cuts the tension of Frodo's mission and downplays the threat of the ring's influence significantly. Not only is he incomprehensibly powerful, but his house is basically a magical bunker. To make sense of Bombadil, fans have been theorizing about his true identity since 1954 when the book was first published. Since both Elrond and Gandalf are familiar with him, some speculate that he's a wizard, or even the god of all things, Eru Ilúvatar himself. Another theory is that he's the spirit of music, which would certainly make sense given the number of songs Tolkien manages to fit into the few chapters we see him in. But what he is doesn't matter nearly as much as why he's there. Thanks to the Fellowship appendices, we know that Jackson doesn't think Bombadil has much to do with the story. What the appendices don't tell us, however, is that Tolkien actually agreed with him. In one of the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, he said, "Bombadil is not an important person to the narrative. I would not, however, have left him in if he did not have some kind of function." He goes on to talk about the war between good and evil, the struggle for power of the Lord of the Rings, and how Bombadil represents a third perspective, that power and control, to some, are meaningless. Essentially, Bombadil represents an ultimate pacifistic idea. He is unmoved by the ambitions and goals of the powerful and finds joy in the small pleasures in life, like the natural world, good food, and a warm fire. This is a worthwhile inclusion in theory, but in practice, it comes off as very frustrating. There's already a character who represents many of these themes, and that's Sam. Sam is the one who takes pleasure in things like using salt to season his food on the road to Mordor.
I thought maybe if we was having a roast chicken one night or something. Roast chicken? You never know.
And the one who just wants to get the job done and return to his simple life in the Shire. And when it comes time to motivate Frodo on the steps of Mount Doom, his mind doesn't go to fame and glory, but to the taste of strawberries. Moreover, Sam doesn't throw a wrench into the story by being a creature of untold strength of will and magical ability. While Tom Bombadil is a merry addition to the book that provides readers with 3 eccentric chapters and more than a few iconic songs, it isn't hard to see why Jackson's team decided to leave him out of the movies. His existence calls into question the entire plot of the story, prompts questions that never get answered, and illustrates themes that are already addressed by existing characters. Still, his presence is a fairly contentious one among fans, landing him at the number 9 spot on Ranker's list of plot points that should have been in the movies. However, those who desperately want to see the yellow-booted fellow up on screen will get their chance, since he's set to make his debut on the 2nd season of Amazon's Rings of Power. While the show hasn't been a resounding success for some fans, maybe a little Bombadil is exactly what it needs.